The North American Free Trade Agreement matters economically to Ontario as almost no other trade deal has. The airwaves are full of what the three countries, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., seem to want out of a renegotiated pact. But what do Canadians want out of it? Let's find out from Shachi Kurl. She's Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute, and we're happy to welcome you back to our studio.
It's so good to be back.
Had a good flight in from the West Coast?
It was a few days ago, but yes.
Good.
It was very
Peaceful,
turbulence-free.
Exactly. Turbulence-free is good.
Yes.
We are going to discuss where Canadians are at on this whole NAFTA renegotiation thing, but I thought we'd set this up by getting a clip from a guy who was on this program not too long ago. This is Craig Alexander, Chief Economist of the Conference Board of Canada, regarding NAFTA to Ontario. Roll it, Sheldon.
We need to negotiate a new NAFTA that actually works for everybody. And the good news is that there actually is scope to improve NAFTA. It could be a win-win-win for all three governments if we actually get the ideal trade deal. But I think the negotiations are going to be very tough. And so I differentiate between the public messages that we get from Trump or other politicians versus what's actually the conversation in the room when they're actually negotiating the trade deal.
But do you think through what could happen to the Ontario economy if the United States makes good, as April says, on this Buy American provision?
It's the single biggest risk to the Ontario economy.
The single biggest risk to the Ontario economy, the Buy American provisions. You've done some polling. What do Canadians think about that?
Well, it's right up there at the top of their priorities in terms of protecting Canada and Canadian companies from those Buy American provisions. You know, we export $300 billion worth of goods and other things to the United States every year. What does that mean? Well, it means it might be raw materials, it might be semi-finished materials, it might be actual retail goods, it might be something from a boutique in Toronto or something from a factory in Saskatchewan. Whatever it is, we need to be protected from those Buy American provisions because they won't just affect things that are labeled made in Canada, but they will go after any component. Oh, there's some alloy or steel or some other goods that come from Canada that are in this material that went into this product. Oh, got to Buy American. It's going to be a big problem. And that's why, 57%, nearly 60% of Canadians list that provision as a major priority.
And if our diplomats are not successful in sort of softening or even erasing the Buy American provisions that President Trump wants through, presumably the implications for our economy are, well, I was going to say incalculable. I guess they're calculable, but massive.
Look, there's a very high level of anxiety among Canadians on how these talks are going to go. I mean, I love Craig Alexander's optimism about the win-win-win. I think in the minds of Canadians, it's a little bit more like duck and cover, brace and hold. Only 5%, 5 people in 100 in this country think that we're going to get all or most of what we want out of these talks.
Well, here's something apparently we do want. Again, you surveyed Canadians and discovered that tougher labor standards to protect workers in all of the countries was the highest ranking issue for Canadians. Have I got that right?
You got it. Go figure. Look, it's one of those things where it's a recognition that in the minds of Canadians, look, we want to ensure that, you know, our labor standards are of a certain level and set at a certain place. We want to make sure that Mexicans, that Americans are also able to be protected by those same standards. It's maybe not something that, again, the Canadian negotiating team is going to come away with, but it is something that's important. The other thing that's really important at the top of that list is the issue around anti-dumping and protecting Canada and Canadian companies and industry from countervailing duties, and that one is a big one.
I want to go back to the labor standards for a second because it appears the Canadian government is seized of this issue as well, because here's what the Canadian press reported earlier this week. Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland boasted Monday that Canada has, quote, put forward the strongest, most progressive labor provisions ever put forward by Canadian trade negotiators. She's absolutely correct. Unifor President Jerry Dias said in an interview, the Canadian proposals are very aggressive and progressive. Aggressive and progressive are what, good places to start for the Canadian negotiating team?
We're not in the room. You know, we are not bugs on the wall. The wall is unfortunately not bugged.
Too bad.
So we don't know exactly.
Love to know what's going on.
Regrettably, right? Wouldn't we all? In terms of the rhetoric that occurs outside in the pressers, once all is said and done, or frankly on the Twitter, with the president sort of weighing in on what he wants to see or doesn't want to see. Look, there are going to be table-banging moments for each of the negotiating teams. We've heard and seen the signals and the signposts very loudly from the Americans around what they are going after. And I think the Canadians are going to say, look, you know, there's give and there's get. If we're going to give, if we have to yield in certain areas, what are we going to get? And we want to make sure, again, that workers, not just in Canada, but across North America, are protected. And again, that is something that really resonates with the Canadian public.
Admittedly, we're not in the room, but do you have any sense, based on what you're hearing, of what the differences might be in Canada's position on labor standards versus America's?
Well, you know, it may be, and I'm not in the room, so let's make that very clear. I'm in this room with you. It may be that in that sense, the Americans who, remember, said that they were going to focus so much of their attention on Mexico. Mexico really has not been a big part of these talks in terms of being in the crosshairs or being at the receiving end of the American bazooka. It may be that they say, look, yeah, on labor standards, we align on that because we want to make sure that Mexican workers are also being protected. And of course, protection for labor standards is also code for you have to pay them more. And the impact of that is maybe they're a little bit less, it's a less attractive proposition for a company to move their workforce to Mexico.
Well, you're right, we're not in the room, but scuttlebutt you hear is that the Americans want to demand, you know, that Mexico raise its minimum wage by at least 800% right off the top. So,
well, when you consider where the Mexican minimum wage is at the moment.
Yes. Okay, on to softwood and supply management. Two issues that are ranking very highly with Canadians, I gather. The softwood lumber, protecting our supply management system, which is basically poultry, eggs, dairy, Eastern Ontario and Quebec in particular. Again, you've done some polling. What'd you find out?
It's an interesting one because, again, protecting that dairy poultry industry is towards the top of that list. What we did is we put all of the Canadian objectives in front of respondents. And we said, okay, this is what Team Canada wants to focus on. This is what they've signaled are going to be their main objectives going into this. And what do you think? You know, give us a sense of what do you think is a major or minor priority. Again, protection around supply management is towards the top of the list. But what's really interesting is when we propose it as a face-off, right? Because we also know that protecting Canadian industry from those countervailing duties and anti-dumping attacks means that that's also a priority. Okay, well, when everything's a priority, what do you pick if you have to pick one or the other? And what I noted and what's quite interesting is that protecting industry from those anti-dumping laws and those anti-dumping measures, for example, like what we've seen with the softwood lumber dispute, actually it tilts towards getting a deal around softwood lumber more than it tilts towards actually protecting that supply managed industry. So, you know, both are important, but if you had to pick one, Sophie's choice here, people are choosing the protection of dairy industry a little bit less than they are than wanting to say that we should get a deal on softwood.
Well, I guess also it depends, and we're going to bring your numbers up here. Sheldon, why don't we bring this chart up? It kind of depends on where you live. First of all, those two bars on the left indicate that on the whole, the nation generally favors by about 10 points getting a better deal on softwood lumber versus maintaining a high tariff on Canada's dairy, poultry, and eggs, the so-called supply management system. But as we go through there, look at the numbers in British Columbia. Clearly a huge gap towards favoring the softwood lumber angle. If we go east, though, in Ontario, a narrow margin favoring supply management. And interestingly enough, even though there's lots of supply management at play in Quebec, the Quebec and Atlantic Canada numbers are just the same, 57 to 43 favoring a better deal on softwood lumber than supply management. You know, if you're the Canadian negotiating team and you see these regional differences in the country about what you ought to make as your priority, what do you do?
Well, there's a bit of political math at stake. There's also a sense of realism at stake, where you think, okay, well, again, what am I prepared to give up versus what am I prepared to double down on? The survey that we did on supply management earlier this summer was pretty telling in that nearly 3/4 of Canadians felt that supply management system, and this is not a story that the dairy industry really wants out there, would be prepared to say either scrap it outright, or if we get into a knife fight at the table with the Americans, if we have to give something up as a bargaining chip, should supply management be on the table? 3/4 say either scrap it outright or put it on the table as a last resort.
Really?
Yes, they do.
It seems like a very high number.
It is a high number.
Huh.
It's a high number, and I mean, granted, more are of the opinion that it should be on the table as a last resort than scrap it outright, but there's a significant number of people, particularly in the West, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, who say, you know what, just get rid of this system. And so we know that the dairy lobby is a very powerful one. We know that they're very good at what they do, and they've put out a lot of research in the last years saying, you know what, Canadians absolutely value and support a supply managed system. Sure, but when we have trade-offs and hard choices to make, and if something's got to give, there is a strong indication that, again, if something had to be placed on the table, okay, what if we put this here and you took it away, what would we get back in return? That would be a possibility.
I think Max Bernier would be happy to hear that, actually.
But
that's another story for another day.
There you go.
Shachi, let's talk about this issue that has just percolated up in the last week or so, and that is the dispute between Bombardier and Boeing and the United States, which has essentially put, I think, about like a 220% tariff on Bombardier's planes, making them, of course, completely uncompetitive and protecting their own Boeing Corporation. You got any numbers on this, or what can you tell us about that?
Well, there's a few different things in this case. I mean, the whole Bombardier issue is one that actually can be considered domestically quite divisive and contentious. Remember when Ottawa said, look, we're going to support the industry, we're going to help you folks to the tune of $375 million. That was not an overall popular decision. A lot of people were going, what the heck? And a lot of people were asking the question in this country, you know, should we be essentially picking winners and losers in industry? Is this kind of support the right thing to do? Well, you know, you now have a situation where the Americans are putting that 220% duty on Bombardier, and it has the potential to really unite public opinion, right? It's no longer an us versus us issue, it's an us versus them issue. And there can be a sense that, you know what, we're trying to play dodgeball here and you're throwing grenades, not dodgeballs. That's not very nice. That's not fair. Canadians have a very big sense of fair play. So there can be a sense of coalescing now, that decision around the why behind these anti-dumping tariffs being slapped, which is like, well, why are you helping Bombardier, Canadian government? That's not fair. That almost kind of fades into the background as the focus becomes more about protecting Canadian interests versus, you know, rolling over.
We've got about a minute and change left to go here, and I want to ask you an odd question. It's an odd question to ask a pollster, but let's be fair. Canadians don't understand, like you and I don't understand, the intricacies of trade negotiations and trade deals and what we ought to put priority.
You don't spend your nights staying up, getting into the nitty-gritty?
Not with the baseball season just about to head into the playoffs. No, I don't. I want to know why it's relevant for our negotiators to know what the average Canadian thinks about where we ought to make priorities in NAFTA negotiations when Canadians probably don't understand or know the intricacies or the nuances of these negotiations to begin with.
I would suggest to you that's not entirely the case.
Okay.
They do, you're right, they may not understand chapter and verse of every issue that's being talked about, but they do have a very strong sense of engagement when it comes to these talks. They understand the relationship. They understand the importance of the relationship. Nearly 50% of Canadians are of the opinion that NAFTA overall has benefited the Canadian economy. That number is 21% in the United States. Think about it a different way. If NAFTA went sideways, if it came to an end, if we missed all our deadlines and ended up in a big, nasty trade war, 60% of Canadians are of the opinion that, you know what, we're in for some big hurt if that happens. That number is 30% in the US. So again, it's all relative. And of course, why should the negotiating team care? To some extent, they may not care, but to some extent, there's a political angle here. You know, this Liberal government is in tough. They have a tough job ahead of it. And then it's like, you know, the old story where you got to come back after a tough negotiation for a car or a house or anything else, and you've got to now sell what you came back with to the Canadian people. Did you get the best deal you could have? And people are watching.
That's Shachi Kurl. She's Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute. Safe flight back to the left coast, and we'll see you next time you're in town.
Love to.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.